You're tuned in to RX Radio.
I've been doing all these jumps on Instagram, and of course because like I jump on Instagram, the first question I get from a lot of people, and it kind of shows you like the way the platform is trending, but a lot of people reached out to me and they went, "Are you trying to like target more athletes now? Are you trying to like target or reach more people who like want to jump and want to do this and that?" And I was like, well, no, there's nothing about, how I train that's, an active thought process and who I'm targeting. I think like yourself and like Shallow, like I think we all arrived and like met each other out of a curiosity of like a curiosity in terms of training and a curiosity of like how the body works. Like the first course prescript was a biomechanics and anatomy course. And I think that if you're passionate about that, you're passionate just about understanding like what is the body capable of and what is the body meant to do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's basically how we've arrived at this place, is that everyone's just kind of taken these different routes of learning and acquiring knowledge in which we can use to better the training for ourselves. And, as we extrapolate out, our clients get the benefit of that, because it's, I think we've all had athletic goals that we reach the bottleneck on. We realize that I can be a much more effective coach with this knowledge than I'll ever be an athlete.
Yeah, 100%. Right. And I think the beauty of being a coach and even zoomed out from being a coach, like, I guess, I don't know, Bagheera always calls us educators. I don't know if I'm as much an educator as Bagheera. I just kind of yell into the internet and I hope people get educated. Yeah, Bagheera is the educator. I just yell. But I think a part of that is like being curious, like when you're an athlete, you have a large emotional investment in your own success and you're a doer. When you're a coach, you have an investment in your client's success and you want to find the optimal path towards it. But when you get to do, like what I do or what you do, and when you get to educate people, well, you get to be curious with no emotional investment. There's no failure in curiosity. There's no failure in learning. Like I'm just going to the gym every day, experimenting because, it's not someone's money. It's not my own career. I get the opportunity to kind of work in more of a sandbox than at the athlete level and then at the coach level.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's where I've gone since we've been in this education space, is that I've learned so much just from teaching and just being alongside you. I use a lot of the principles from the skill acquisition stuff that you teach. I've learned a lot from Shallow, Bagheera, everyone on the team that I can apply to my own training in an experimental way. And I think that's the hallmark of a good coach, is that you're willing to experiment on yourself before you experiment on other people. Right? Is because I have a bunch of experience in a bunch of different ways that I've refined to make my training better. And I can give someone a really good, accurate way to progress in Olympic weightlifting or strength training or rehab because of that, because I've fucked myself up a lot. But at the same time, it's an ongoing process. We're always learning, right? So I look at you doing these jumps and I'm like, fuck yeah, Killian's doing this. I can't wait to talk to him so I can learn how to integrate this into not only my own training, but the training of my clients. Because I'll be honest, plyometrics have always been something I've shied away from in terms of prescribing them to my clients, simply because I'm ignorant, right? Is I don't necessarily know the proper application of that and where that falls into all of this. I've used, some throws or box jumps in the past as kind of a load limiting procedure. Is that I don't want you on a barbell, so we're going to produce force in a way that's going to not actually load you. And that's pretty much the extent of my understanding of this sort of stuff. So I think it's really interesting to watch you go through this and, going from like dropping in from the rafters and, absorbing ground force and what that looks like and what's the implication of that in training and what are the benefits and how can you pass that along how can you learn from that before you pass it along to your clients?
Yeah, 100%, and I think, my interest in pursuing, a programming for myself now, that's, I would say, 70% plyometric or ballistic and then 30% weightlifting to support what I'm doing from a plyometric side. I think it came about as, like I have an athletic history of playing rugby, running track and field, pursuing bobsled and being, terrible at it. And a large part of all of those sports was, something that looks more athletic, looks like running, looks like jumping. So, for me, also looking at, teaching skill acquisition again this year, I thought every time I teach skill acquisition, I dive headfirst into learning something new. I learn a new language, or I learn fucking an instrument, or I learn a new way of training. And for me, I was like, well, let's do plyometrics. And, I think we might've spoke about it briefly, or I talked about it with Denai, I think, actually, where I was talking about in PSL1, and when I first got introduced to you and Jordan, and we were talking in PSL1, it was this idea of stability. And stability was the resistance of force, which was really cool because I never really thought of that before. A lot of, powerlifting especially is producing force. And I think, a lot less of, hyper-specific powerlifting training is looking at resisting force, especially resisting force, through multiple planes of movement. And then, I met you guys, we started teaching, the lockdown happened, and I think everyone and their mother sent me a hip airplane video. And that was sick. It was really cool to watch people like explore stability and explore finding their body in space and talking about proprioception and skill acquisition. But the side of that I saw was like, well, we kind of talk about it in L1 too. It's like, well, once you have stability, you possess it. Like, you get to own that. But stability is the idea of not moving. It's not translating force. It's resisting it. It's, to be great at being stable is to be great at standing very, very still. And then the next component of L1 that we teach is walking and breathing. So there had to, for me, looking at the complexity of it, I was like, well, this has to go further. If we can teach stability and we can, quote unquote, master stability, and we understand that function is the way the body moves and breathes, well, what's next? How do we not convert stability, but what's the stage after resisting force? And the stage after resisting force in my mind would be transferring force. And then if the stage after resisting force, if the stage after resisting force is transferring force, well, there needed to be a force that existed first to resist, to transfer, to create. So it's like, okay, now there's 4 steps to this process. And then that's how I kind of started diving into this. And by diving into understanding movement just through, 4 basic states of force, it applied, to an entire program in a way. But it allowed me to look at exercises very, very different, or look at how an athlete moves in a very different way.
Yeah, I think that's a really accurate way of portraying it. And that's going to be, I'll stick with what I know the best and what I'm most comfortable in, but in weightlifting, or you can transfer this to powerlifting, anytime you're trying to move a barbell, is before you can exert any sort of meaningful force, you have to understand how to resist the force of not only gravity, but resist the force of that barbell. You also need to understand how to transfer that force through, we'll say, a stable core, stable hip, knee, ankle, shoulder, elbow, wrist, whatever that might be. And then once you can do that effectively, then it comes down to being able to produce enough force to accomplish the task, right? That's what the performance gets boiled down to. It becomes more narrow on that goal as you have these requisite adaptations to be able to focus in on that. And I think that's where a lot of people, they kind of bastardize this process, is they look at the end goal and they look at you jumping and they say, all right, I'm just going to jump. And if I can just jump, then I'm doing the thing. I'm going to get better at the thing, when maybe they don't possess the building blocks or the foundations that are going to allow them to be effective at doing this, because they can't resist movement, or they can't resist force in the appropriate places to be able to be effective at that end goal.
Yeah. And I think that's where, like, for me, especially, I started doing plyometrics, and I started doing low level plyometrics. So hops, skips, things like that, just to move my body through space after using a barbell for so long. And then, like anybody, I was like, oh, plyometrics is jumping, so I'm going to jump on a box. Well, I'm really good at creating force, right? I would say that I'm like concentrically biased. So I can create a ton of concentric force. I can move up and I can move forward. What I'm really bad at doing is eccentrically absorbing force. And this kind of shines its ugly head, or rears its ugly head, not when I'm standing still and trying to jump, but when I'm going from one position to another position. So I can jump higher standing still than I can if I say take a gather step, or if I run up, because my body's mechanics in absorbing force are poor, my mechanics in producing force are great. So there's this moment of eccentric force absorption, transference of force, amortization phase I'm very bad at. I can transfer and produce, but I can't absorb and produce. So for me, it's not an assessment of the angles or the positions I get into. It's the assessment of when my body is in motion, can I go from one direction to another, right? Can I make a negative force, a positive force? And I'm very, very poor at that. And I taught L1 last week, and we were talking about the hip, and we did the shoe wear assessment. And I picked up my shoes that I jump in all the time. And my right shoe is completely worn off in the forefoot and on the inside of it. All of the tread is away on the inside of the front of my right shoe. On my left shoe, the inside tread is completely fine and the outside tread is completely gone because my left leg absorbs force and my right leg produces. So we have probably, to some degree, poor mechanics at the pelvis, so poor pelvic orientation right off the bat. There's probably also then going to be like a discrepancy from like quad, hamstring, glute med to hip flexor function. And then down from that, there's going to be one leg that can stop moving and one leg that can start moving. But the unfortunate thing is, like you talked about, to produce force, you have to load it first. So I'm going to have one leg that can load and one leg that's always producing force from a dead stop.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting way looking at that assessment is because there's a lot of things you can pull from that, but that's looking kind of broad spectrum. End of the route is when we're talking performance, what is the implication here, right? Is that there's probably these biomechanical biases that are predisposing you to absorbing force better on the left side, producing force better on the right side, which is, probably, the exact implication of that wear on your shoes. But if we get caught too much in the biomechanics and learning about this, how do we bridge that gap? I guess that's what I'm getting at here. That's my question for you is, okay, we notice these things. We know that you probably have maybe an internal rotation bias on the right, external rotation bias on the left. There's some sort of pelvic orientation that is predisposing you to that. Now, once we identify that, how do we bridge the gap from, okay, this is what we're seeing. These are the performance implications. Now, how do we intervene?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question because, we always run into these bottlenecks in training. And I would say that, this isn't something, again, I always want to preface this, but I'm not saying take your 75-year-old client and go, hey, we're going to do power pogos and drop jumps today. But if you're working with the populations that you or I work with, where we're working with athletes that play a real sport, or say, strength or power athletes, these can be great ways at identifying or creating these markers of, say, like injury reduction, like possible injury reduction or possible, performance bottlenecks. And what I would say bridges that gap or becomes the intervention is looking at someone who has a bias to absorption or a bias to production of force and going, we don't need to keep working on this, because your bottleneck to make that better is going to be the other side of this. Understanding that it's a constant conversation allows us then to pull back into the programming and go, is our programming predominantly force production based, or is our programming prominently force absorption based? We could look at this in a very broad spectrum from, to what degree do we hinge, do we squat? Squat's going to be our force absorbers. Good squatters are good force absorbers. Good deadlifters are great force producers.
Yeah.
So we can look at someone's program immediately and go, well, let's pull back. For me, for example, let's pull back on the hinging, because the hinging is only pushing me further through space. So let's pull back on the hinging and let's introduce more knee dominant mechanics in my programming, which is something that I know even outside of looking at plyometrics is something that I shy away from anyways. I do a ton of hinging and very little squatting. So it's like, there's obviously, some type of adaptation from the gross programming. And then, on a more detailed level, it's like, okay, well, we can actually start to instill these mechanics in you by, pulling back from one style of movement to another style of movement. And then maybe we can apply these more like complex or detailed biomechanical analyses, right? Like where we can start to look at, does someone need to be able to posteriorly translate their center of mass? Do we need this person pulling away? Does this person maybe bias extension mechanic? Are they more globally extended? Well, I think if we can first identify where the where the gap is in absorbing or producing force, then when we start to apply these more complex biomechanical models, I think what happens is then the biomechanical model has a more immediate translation to performance.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And this is something I've identified in a lot of people. I try to identify in a lot of people in weightlifting or powerlifting. You can see this. There's two movements that come to mind specifically is in the squat is how well can they handle the turnaround in the hole? Is
Yeah.
that from that loading to that concentric phase is are you able to maintain tension? Do you have a good understanding of how to transfer eccentric force into concentric force? And then one that's really apparent in weightlifting is someone's power clean, right? Is the ability to pull under that barbell and stop that barbell immediately. That's a really good expression of them understanding how to absorb force. So I think that's something that we can take these specific things, or we can at least observe an athlete in their natural habitat, and we can start to pull these things out. All right, this person, and I think it's probably safe to say that most people have a concentric bias in training,
100%.
right? Most people are better at concentrically producing force than eccentrically absorbing force. And I think that's the value in the things that I see you doing right now is, like you said, it's understanding how to properly eccentrically load, because that's something that we can't properly eccentrically load if we don't have biomechanically sound positions. So I think that's how this all kind of loops back together, is that we need to have some sort of understanding of how can I arrange my core, my pelvis, my hip, knee, ankle in a way where I'm biomechanically sound to now eccentrically load without having any sort of feedback from whether it's the ground or a barbell or a dumbbell or whatever that might be. Is you have to be very efficient in creating those positions in more plyometric based exercises.
Yeah, I was talking to Max Schmarzo, who we've had on this show, Strong by Science. Really, really smart guy. Definitely somebody I borrow a lot from in the plyometric area. And I was having a conversation with him yesterday, and he was talking about this Verkhoshansky principle of shear. And shear is literally the moment of amortization, where negative and positive meet. There's like an inequatable. There's an inequatable combination of forces at like the skeletal level and the muscular level. And we can't say from structure to function what is absorbing and creating more force in that moment of shear when two forces collide. So like when you jump and your foot hits the ground, we can't equate how much of that goes to muscle function or how much of that is owned by structure. In that moment, Verkhoshansky described it as shear. He just goes, everything happens all at once. And both things, function and structure, need to exist. But we can't say this dumps all the way into function or this dumps into structure. It's a shared load in that moment. And I think this goes to your point of people being poor eccentric, like being bad at eccentric mechanics or force absorption. When we look at injury prevention, rehabilitation, or we look at even longevity of programming, in every movement, depending on ground contact, there's a lesser or greater amount of time in the sheer moment of a lift. The longer amount of time doesn't necessitate more sheer force, but we have these two moments of time in training where we can have like acute and quick moment of shear, and we can have a prolonged moment of shear. One requires a bit more stability than the other. Quicker ground contacts with shear force actually require more stability than longer ground contacts because we have less proprioception. But in that moment of shear, like you're saying, if we can meet that moment of shear with good mechanics, we're definitely going to be able to move further away from possible injury in most cases, and probably closer to repeatable performance, right? And performance is repeatable, right? I can hit a half court shot at the park. I can't hit a half court shot 30 times at the park. I don't perform well at hitting half court shots. So it's like, that's what we need, right? Is repeatable performance in training. So we can start to measure all these things people fucking want to measure all the time.
Yeah, I like ground contact as a measure of that, because if you have less ground contact time, that just shows that you're being more efficient at this process. Is that you have a good, I'll use the word understanding, but it's a very subconscious thing, is that you have a good process for buffering that force and changing from absorbing to producing immediately. And the longer you see, and you can see this I've spent years in a CrossFit gym. You can see this as someone jumps rope, right? That's a pretty good example. Is that if you can see someone that's super springy, like boxers do, they're super light on their feet. They just see, it looks like they float because they're not spending any time on the ground. That's a really efficient process of being able to absorb and then produce, versus someone that goes down to a full foot contact. You see them break at the hip, break at the knee, and it's almost like a squat jump every single time. You're being very inefficient at buffering that force that of just you and gravity, right?
Yeah.
So I see that as the implication here of, okay, go ahead, run with it.
No, I was just going to say, like, yeah, that's essentially the concept of rate of force development, right? So how long it takes to reach a peak force would be rate of force development. So skipping rope, things with low ground contact time, short amounts of time on the ground, any plyometric where you spend less time on the ground is a really great driver of rate of force development. Because what you're doing is you're working towards the end of the force velocity curve, that is speed. I'm hitting the ground, I'm producing force as fast as possible. Now, although those might not be peak forces, we're potentiating for the speed necessary to reach peak force. So fast ground contact time, skipping rope is an excellent example. Doing a pogo jump or a single leg pogo is a less complex jump rope. Like, you're just not holding a rope, but you're effectively going through the same biomechanical process. So that's, something people can jump into right away, is just doing pogos and then grab a rope and increase the complexity of those pogos. But no, like, skipping rope's a big one. Another place where I would say I see a direct relationship to RFD, rate of force development, and ground contact time in weightlifting as an outsider and as a guy who's trying to be better at weightlifting is the jerk. And this is where I see it, is the amount of time someone spends in the dip before a jerk. You see like a level of confidence in people being able to dip and then explode into the jerk. Or you see, like, I also train at a CrossFit gym, people that are doing like this push press to jump where they like load their legs and then they jump in the air to do the jerk, maybe like myself. So I think ground contact time, if we were to pull it back and continue to make low ground contact time exercises more difficult based on gravity, we could essentially start to look at something like a jerk, where we have an exercise.
I really like that example.
Yeah, because it's like, I'm going from here, I'm going to drop, and then I'm going to jump, right? And it's like, I did it today with power jerks based on honestly your recommendation. But what I did as my lead up to that was I did power pogos with short ground contact time. Then I did seated box jumps, catching in the power position with a bent knee, which is inevitably where I'm going to get to in something like a power jerk. And then I did them with no arms. So I had a bar on my back. So I limited my ability for my upper body to contribute to the jump. Then I did one last set without the bar. And I used arm swing to potentiate maximal force. So rate of force development. I reached that peak force. Then I started to load the barbell, and I had this concentric mechanic of short ground contact time and jump. And I was able to lock out 20 kilos more than I locked out last week.
Amazing. Yeah. So, I really like this example too, because it's making it very real for me. Is in terms of progression, right? Is what's the application of this? We know that this stuff exists. It's out there. There's a bunch of words and thought processes around it, but you can literally see this. And this is bridging a gap in my brain, because I've always equated it to people that are, stronger in that concentric, usually have that deeper dip. They take more time to produce that force, and they have a harder time understanding that it should be this very explosive movement. But the difference there is that they're trading off speed for force production, right? We talked about force equals mass times acceleration, right? Is that they're taking more time to create the same amount of force, versus someone that's more efficient or effective in this process is going to take them a lot less time to create that force. So now, understanding that piece of all of this is that you can start to layer in and say, okay, now what's the progression of something that we can do with maybe lower levels of fatigue at a higher frequency that can start to elicit that same adaptation? And that's exactly what you said. The progression through of going through, okay, we're going to start with pogo jumps, something that's a lot lower tiered, a little more entry level, to get you to have some sort of understanding of the concept of how to coordinate this movement of absorbing eccentric force and then channeling that and changing that into concentric force. force. So the way that you just loop that all together really bridged that gap in my mind.
Okay. Yeah.
And now that's something that is really applicable.
Yeah, immediately. And I think that's where you can start to break down. And, I don't want to do this podcast or like go teach skill acquisition this year and everybody think like the new thing is everybody has to do plyos. I don't think so. But I think if we can understand the concepts behind plyometric training, which is what Verkhoshansky did, just so everybody knows, like largely all of the bullshit that we talk about in the strength and power world is based off this guy who studied plyometrics, and then people kept adding weight to them. And then we arrived at the style of training most of us do today, was taking the concepts of a jumping guy and just keep adding weight. And now we have a lot of the same principles. But I think if we can understand that, we can start to look at a session like today. I would consider today was a more, for me, vertical session. I did a snatch complex and then I moved to jerks. So for me, when I looked at what my warm-up was going to be from a plyometric point of view, I was like, I'm catching in the power position the entire day and I'm going to jerk. So what I did with my plyos for my warm-up was it was a concentric based plyometric workout, because I was looking at short ground contact times and getting as high as possible. So I was like, I want to jump and I want to do it fast. So I looked at a low ground contact time, concentric plyo warm-up. Now, say I'm going to do hip cleans or some fucking bullshit, or I'm going to do like full snatch or a full clean and jerk workout.
Reverse curls.
Reverse curls, loaded reverse curl. Then what I'm probably going to do in my warm-up is something that's more of an eccentric oriented plyo warm-up, because I'm looking at absorbing force is the next thing that I'm going to do, right? So it's like, I want to do depth jumps and drop jumps or higher box jumps. I want to do broad jumps even. I want to do things where I'm starting to manage for force absorption, because a large part of, catching a full snatch, catching a full clean is I'm going to encounter this maximal effort load and I'm going to need to be stable at stopping it from going through the floor.
Right. Yeah. I like that thought process a lot. I guess my next question for you is then on the other side of this, it's all a progression, right?
Yeah.
Once we get to the hip airplane, we don't need to do the hip airplane anymore, right? Once we get to a certain point with plyometrics, I'm sure there's a diminishing return, right? Is that
100%.
this is going to be one of those processes that we have to have a lot of front loaded learning. We need to build these adaptations. We need to build tissue tolerance over time to be able to be effective in this and make sure that we're not predisposing ourselves to injury by doing this stuff or by increasing the demands of this. So where does it go? When you get to X point, when do we need to just maintain X and continue to train? Have you reached that point, or have you reached that understanding of where that point is yet?
So I think that's a great question, because this goes to like something we were going to talk shit about before we started recording, but it's this idea of progression. Now, the way I would say, the way we in this industry look at progression is unfortunately mainly through the understanding of hypertrophy or general strength. So I don't want to say strength because I don't think that's true, but general strength and hypertrophy, the progression makes a lot of sense. It's your standard linear, add a little bit of weight or add a rep, so on and so forth forever. And that works. That works when what we're trying to do is reach a proximity to failure, because adding load or adding repetition is always going to bring me closer to the edge, which is failure. And that's what we know is a large driver of hypertrophy. But when we start to move away from something that's, we talked about it earlier, a happy accident, general strength and hypertrophy is what I would consider a happy accident. We can go in and bump into things, and, the long and short of it is something will occur. There's a massive complexity and nuance, just so everybody knows I'm not bashing hypertrophy, to do what shallow does and to do what Bagheera does. An incredible depth of nuance to that in understanding how to balance the workload of someone who's constantly reaching failure. That is complex. That I'm not saying is easy, but at the actual physiological level of incurring hypertrophy, it's not a complex conversation. Like, we can take the hypertrophy course, learn it from a mechanistic level. But the thing is that's great about that is it's never going to change. Bagheera is going to teach you once. And as long as you don't forget, you never have to worry about hypertrophy changing. When you look at closer to what you and I do, though, we have to understand that what we do has an immediate level of complexity to it. There's a level of coordination. Mm-hmm. And there's, in the engineering world and in the construction world, I was talking to Schmarzo about this because he was talking with the Verkhoshansky principle of shear. And I said, shear is a lot like in construction, we have dead and live loads. So every material that's ever been used to build something has a dead load associated and a live load associated. So a dead load is how much force, oftentimes compressive and shear, that a material can withstand. So when they build a stadium, that stadium empty has like the Oracle Arena or whatever it's called, wherever Golden State plays. That place has a dead load rating where it's like it can withstand this amount of force. But then they have to do an equation for live load because fucking people go inside and yell and move around. And there was a mall in China where they didn't equate for live load. And on the grand opening of the mall, the entire mall collapsed and killed everybody inside. So,
well, fuck.
Yeah, and that's nuts. And it's a crazy real world example. But like you said, like identifying for tissue tolerance and understanding maybe what's more complex about what you or I do, powerlifting or weightlifting, and from weightlifting to like running or throwing a fucking javelin. And it's like that, I would say it's like powerlifting bridges the gap between non-complex and complex. Weightlifting, very complex, like golf with a barbell. But then we have a guy running 35 miles an hour. And every time his foot hits the ground, he is absorbing between 1.8 and 3.2 times his body weight. And it's like, and he's doing that for 41 steps. Massively complex live load to deal with, And when we think about it, like that's maybe Usain Bolt.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Usain Bolt weighs 81 kg, maybe. Now look at people that Shallows worked with that are in the NFL. That guy is absorbing the same body weight coefficient of force over the same amount of strides, but his dead load is 280 pounds. So what is his live load equivalent? So, back to the question you were asking in terms of progression, intensity will always be a consequence. Intensity will happen. We don't ever have to worry about making plyometrics more intense. That'll be a consequence of what you said, efficiency and effectiveness. Like you don't have to make sprinting more intense. If you get good at sprinting, you'll run faster. It's going to happen. That's the reward. Same thing with jumping. I don't need to try and jump higher. When we progress plyometrics, and what I would say from even looking at weightlifting from the outside in, if I was looking at it in terms of training, I want to progress the complexity. Because what I'm testing for is your ability to withstand and to strategize for A, live load, but B, changing environment. Like I have a really good friend, Justin Santos. He works at the gym that I work at. He's very, very strong lifter. Like I think the other day he was like doing multiple behind the neck jerks with 130, like sets of 5 or something. And it's like insane. And I don't lift when he lifts. I just go and jump around. Dude, so I'm going to send you his thing. He's so fucking strong. But it's like when I look at him, his ability to get there, like you, like he's really fucking strong, just like you are with weightlifting. Your training has to progress in its complexity so that you don't die. Like that is the meaningful coached. That's the meaningful reactive progression to training is as you get ultimately good at something, your training style increases in its complexity. Like plyometrics for me, I jumped off a box that was 5 feet 8 inches, the exact same height as me. And someone's like, should I be trying to jump off higher boxes? And I was like, no, this was really dumb. I don't need to jump off a 6'5" box. Like you said, there's diminishing returns on that. I need to increase the complexity. I need to be able to jump off of instead of a 178 centimeter box, I need to drop off of a 90 centimeter box, jump onto a 60 centimeter box, drop off that box, jump back on a 90 centimeter box. Can my body move through this functional, can my body function through this idea of how we interact with force, right? Like, what is my capacity to operate in a physical space? I think would be the progression.
Yeah, that provides a lot of clarity too, because now when you say it that way, I can boil it down in my brain to specificity and variance, right?
Yeah.
And that's exactly how I program for weightlifting, for strength, for even rehab, is that okay, if we want to get to a point of specificity with force absorption and force production, then we can get to a point where we're training that very specifically and we can have a high level of output. That's your ability to absorb force from a 5'8" box down to the ground. Okay, we've done that. We've done that to the extent that we need to. That's your 1 rep max snatch, right?
Yeah.
Now, for us to continue to progress this, we need to add variety in so we could train on a consistent basis without incurring too much specific fatigue or too much fatigue on specific tissue, so that we can now buffer your capacity to do this better, but without incurring the damage that's associated with you dropping in from a 6-foot box or a 6.5
Yeah.
foot box and just blowing out an Achilles. So that makes a ton of fucking sense. And it makes it really, really real world applicable. Is that, okay, we've done the thing, we've kind of tested this in a very specific way. Now let's add variety to it so we can continue to progress, but we don't need to be dropping in off the top rope every single time we're doing plyometrics.
Yeah. And I think that's where it's like, I know when I first started teaching with Prescript and when I first started posting, I always talked about these like runways of progression and that. But that was starting from a non-complex place, right? That's starting, the idea of runway of progression 3 years ago was if you have an untrained client, here's a runway of progression that did progress in its complexity at what we need the joint to do, right? It moved in its complexity from least extended to most extended, or least flexed to most flexed, or most center of mass to least center of mass. But like that still begins and ends. Like the plane takes off when complexity starts. And then when you move into a complex space, that I would say is definitely more about, the sport that you do and the baseball players that I work with and the fucking 6'6" pro wrestler I train. Now it's not about, there is no progression. My choices as a coach aren't progressing someone. Like you said, they're ensuring that the athlete themselves progresses. Like I'm not concerned about creating progression for athletes. I'm concerned about creating a program that allows athletes to progress. Again, it's a consequential thing. I don't need to make a guy run faster. He'll run faster if my program allows him to recover, repeat, and then express what he's built.
Yeah, absolutely. You're giving them the capacity to express their athleticism is what you're doing. Is
Yeah.
you're putting them in positions that are going to fill gaps that they might have in terms of capacity, ability, range of motion, stability, which it's crazy to me. It never ceases to amaze me how incapable athletes can be in these very basic ground level things. And then once you start to fill these gaps, or at least give them the tools to start to fill these gaps, you see them just do what they do better. And that's a cool place to be.
Yeah, I think that's the most interesting thing. And I think that's where, in what you and I do as coaches and then as educators, like, again, that goes back to the idea, like there's not a linear progression to this, right? Like once we add in this layer of complexity, Shallow always uses like the target when he's talking about assessing the squat, right? And it's, a squat's not a good assessment of the hip. It's like shooting a handgun from 500 yards away. And it's like, man, just throwing sets and reps at someone is essentially the same to me. Like when we work with things that become more complex, it's really about being able to like narrow in your focus and go like, this is what we need to address. And then it doesn't need to be a progression, right? A progression sounds like it takes a really long time to me. I don't want to do that. I want to give someone the thing in that moment that solves the problem. I don't want to give them, a 5-step process to fixing it. I want to go today, right now, this is the thing you do. Leave the gym, feel better, and we're good, or create that stimulus. My shoulder hurts. Let's not back squat. Let's do this exercise. It creates the same stimulus and you can go home, and on this date, this moves us at this speed and this allows us to walk out of the gym, having hit the strongman thing at the circus and the buzzer goes off or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess my question in terms this is all for my curiosity, by the way, but I'm getting a lot out of this, so we're going to keep going.
Sick.
So when we're talking plyometrics, like as I'm looking at organizing a session, where does this belong? Because I look at this as pretty high skill, pretty high demand, but also relatively low fatigue level. So understanding that is, I mean, that's my understanding of it. Where do I place this in a session to be most effective?
Yeah, so I think this happens at the very beginning of a session. And I think for the most part for people, this can replace a large majority of what their warm-up is. You know, if you have very specific things you need to work on in your warm-up, get those things done, and then start to use these plyometric, I was about to say progressions, but start to use these plyometric approaches to replace your warm-up, right? Because we're going to largely involve stability in our plyometric warm-up. Stability needs to exist for us to do much of what we do from a plyometric perspective anyways, right? If I want to go from standing, falling on my face and catch myself in a push-up, I need stable shoulders. So they already have to be there for me to get here. So once you've checked off stability and you have an athlete that comes in, they do their one or two things and they go, yeah, I feel good, hop right into plyometrics. And then the way I would look at progressing them for me specifically is I would go, oftentimes I'll go from isometric first to plyometric. And the isometric exercise that I'll choose will hold a position that I'm looking to get to in the plyometric movement. So that's my future model, right? Like I'll do a push-up hold even, right? Like I'll hold like a long, like a super maximal ISO for a push-up, or I'll hold an extended ISO for a split squat. Like you and I were talking about front foot elevated ISOs for the split squat. And that's something before doing plyos on my force absorption days, I'll hold front foot elevated split squats for 30, 60, sometimes I've programmed even 90-second holds, which are really terrible.
Gross.
Yeah, it's the worst. So I'll do that, and then I'll go into plyos, and I always start with something that's low complexity and low ground contact time. So I want something that's easy for me to execute, and that I can do with a lot of repetitions in a short period of time. Like I want a low ground contact time, so I'm accumulating a lot of repetitions of interacting with whatever the surface might be. So pogos are usually a way I'll start almost all of my plyometric workouts, with some pogo. So maybe a bilateral stationary pogo, just jumping straight up and down, a bilateral single leg pogo, or I could do forward pogos, backwards pogos, bilateral single leg. And then if you get good at pogos, that's something that could move into a skip. So you could do an A skip, you could do a B skip, you could do a piston, and that has a high level of complexity. So like you were saying, where does it go? Well, my goal isn't to just pogo to the ceiling. It's like, okay, now I come in and I do pogos, and it's kind of like the hip airplane. I do a set, I have a lot of bounce, I feel great, I'm staying in one spot, I'm not bouncing all over the floor, which is something most people will come into contact with first. So it's like, if I can surpass pogos, I'm going to go into skips, which I did today. I was doing like A skips forwards, and then I did A skips backwards. And I was like, okay, if I can do these forwards, can I do them backwards? Do I have the positional awareness to be able to recreate this rhythmic movement, but in the opposing direction? So again, it's another added layer of complexity, but it's a low ground contact time. So I go for something ISO, I go for something low ground contact time, low complexity. Then I'll do a self-limiting variation of whatever my final plyometric movement's going to be. So self-limiting could be a drop jump or a depth jump before a box jump, because the floor is self-limiting, right? I'm jumping off of a box, I'm absorbing force, I can only jump so high. Or what I could do is I could do a movement and I could take the arm swing out of it. So I can hold a ball, or I can put a dowel on my back. Limit the arm swing is going to limit my output. And then the final thing I'm going to do is something that potentiates me, which is going to be less complex, less constrained, and it's going to be something I do for more maximal effort. So this could be going from a drop jump, no arm swing, to a concentric box jump with arm swing.
Beautiful. I love it. And as you're going through this, I'm kind of matching this again with, how does this fit in, or what does this parallel with the warm-up process that I think about, or the process of organizing a workout that I think about. And the word that comes to mind for me is self-organization. right?
Yeah.
Is that you're using these isometric exercises as a form of testing and understanding, building proprioceptive awareness or positional awareness around self-organization in this position that's going to have the greatest demand of shear for your isometric. And that's something that we want to later, again, to use skill acquisition terminology, associate to more demanding movements or maybe even more loadable movements in the rest of your workout. So that makes a ton of sense to organize it that way, progress it that way. And I'd imagine this start to finish is a relatively expedient process, right? I can't imagine this taking more than 10, 15 minutes to go through this at the beginning of a workout and then move on to the things that you're trying to train maybe for max force or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I don't think it takes, any longer for me than 10 to 15 minutes. Again, none of these things are, a true exercise of exertion. So, I'll run through each one of these things once or twice. And again, it's more of like a box to check. I do it, it feels good. I execute it technically, move on to the next thing. And if I do something twice and I can't execute on it technically, I stop. And then that has me rethink maybe what I'm going to do for the day, right? How complex should my main movement be if I can't self-organize for something as simple as jumping up and down in one spot? If you can't jump up and down in the same 2x2 square at the gym, you probably shouldn't be max snatching that day because you're probably going to run away with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, again, the word that comes to mind as we think of this process is creating and assessing dynamic stability, right? Is your ability to dynamically create stability now so that you can absorb, transfer, and produce force relatively quickly or as quickly as the task that you're trying to associate that with demands.
Yeah, 100%, right? And that's where, like with weightlifting, I'd look at low ground contact times across the board. Now, maybe you're working with a power lifter or you are a powerlifting lifter listening to this. There's obviously, like I had said earlier, a huge benefit to low ground contact time for rate of force development. But if you want to use this for your workout, you can do longer ground contact times because your sport never leaves the ground. At most, it's maybe ballistic, right? So it's like we can start to look at a sport and go, where do we lie on this ground contact time kind of line, right? Are we short ground contact time? Are we long ground contact time? Do I need more of one? Do I need less of the other? So we can start to assess for that in warm up. And the way I think of it, honestly, in terms of like how I organize my session is an isometric allows me to understand gravity, right? It's the dead load. What is gravity doing to my body in space, right? I think Baxter's thing or Shallow's thing is like, are you losing a fight to gravity? And it's like, well, an isometric is a really good fight against gravity. Hold this position and don't lose. If you can do that, then let's beat gravity. It's like meet gravity where it's at, isometric. Beat gravity, jump off the ground. Jump off the ground is winning. If you can get your feet off the ground, you've won against gravity. But the thing is, like you said, it's like, if you can jump really high off the ground, now gravity needs to get heavier because you need to come back down to earth, right? It's like, well, if I can beat gravity, I need to create more load, right? I need to pull myself back down to the ground so I can then build up those qualities that allow me to beat gravity next time by even more. So in like really simple, silly terms, it's like meet gravity where it's at, defeat gravity, make gravity harder is the way I program my session.
Fuck yeah, I love that. And I think even looking at this through a different lens, especially as we speak about powerlifting, because I've worked with a lot of powerlifters.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I love powerlifters, but powerlifters suck. I mean, not in the sense of like you as a human, but in the sense of you understanding how to use your body to effectively create and produce and buffer forces is the positions that powerlifting pulls you into, if you're good at it, are very contradictory to biomechanics, right? So this can actually be used as an assessment tool that if you don't have a good understanding of how to self-organize and how to even get into these positions and buffer force isometrically and then produce these forces and buffer these forces dynamically, then we need to look further into maybe the biomechanics of this is what's really going on that's preventing you from creating these positions, because it's instability at the root of it. Is you're not stable enough to buffer the forces in this position isometrically, then that's a problem if we try and do that with, gravity plus, barbells, as we add barbells into the equation, then you're going to have a really bad time as we start to load that, because we're not loading a stable position. We're loading structure then, which is kind of a lot of the premise of powerlifting. But the more undoing of that loading of the structure that we can do in periods where we're not competing, then the more effective you will be when you get into those periods where, okay, we understand that to be good at powerlifting, you're going to have to use your structure. So let's make sure that we can increase your capacity to do that over time.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point, right? And it goes back to that concept of like this moment of shear, where it's an inequatable equation of how much structure or function is being used. But the way we can better equate that equation, like you said, is at least assessing for how much function this person has. Where it's like, listen, when Herbie takes 980 for a back squat, we can't say how much structure or function he's using at the bottom in that moment of negative to positive to turn around. But in his training outside of the barbell,
Right.
we can ensure that he has the function in that amortization moment at the bottom of the squat. So we can go, at least when he gets into the bottom, we know there is function there. And we even know we can contribute to there being more function at that moment. So even though we can't actually equate for what happens when people reach peak force development, it's inequatable to differentiate structure to function. What we can say is, I know we had this much function going in. It's there when we get there. Or you can say, yeah, that guy has no idea where the fuck he is. And that's exactly why he exploded, because it was all his bones. Or you can tell an athlete, right? Like, you can do this all day, but this is all your bones at the bottom. Based on the fact that you can't hold a front foot elevated split squat for 60 seconds, you're all bones at the bottom of this high bar back squat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an important conversation to have with people too, right? Is as you start to implement this stuff, it's important for them to understand why. Because if it's someone that's used to, a lot of times the mentality in powerlifting is, okay, I'm just going to funnel down more reps, less weight, to less reps, more weight. And anything outside of that is, it's not going to give them the stimulus that they deem to be a workout that's going to drive progress. Right. Yeah. So getting that understanding and having that buy-in around, these are the building blocks. This is the foundation for a back squat. If you don't have this, you do not pass go. You do not collect $200. You do not back squat. Is we need you to be able to do these things so that you can back squat past this next meet or the meet after that. Is that these are the things that are going to allow you to be most effective in loading the tissues that we need to load at the appropriate times. Even if some of that is indiscernible, maybe it's not about discerning it, but it's just about increasing their capacity to do that in general.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? No true strength sport is a measure of concentric force development. All strength sports are way more a measure of the transference of force, because everyone can unrack whatever weight they want to. No one's stopping you. The challenge is making it go the opposite direction, right? So it's like at a weightlifting meet, the load on the bar just goes up for the whole meet. It can keep going up. The guy who wins is the guy who takes it off the ground and puts it over his head, right? He won at transferring force. The entire time you're weightlifting, you're fighting against gravity, like you said, gravity plus. The sport, from the moment it starts, the moment the bar leaves the ground, like you're playing a game against gravity plus. The guy who's good at it is the transferring force guy, because you're constantly in contact with a negative force and you're trying to be a greater positive force. So when we look at it, right, like there's no powerlifting meet that starts on the pins and is just measuring the concentric force development. No weightlifting meet starts off of blocks and you just have to unrack it and support it, So it's like both of these sports, powerlifting is the idea of transferring that force, and weightlifting is the idea that there's like no moment in weightlifting outside of recovering the clean that you're really not encountering a very strong negative force.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, this has been a very good educational experience for me,
Sick,
for
man.
my own curiosity this whole time.
Yeah.
No, it's been really cool. And it's cool to see you put this stuff into practice in your training. I'm loving watching you weightlift.
Thanks,
can
man.
we tell the people what you have in store for your weightlifting career?
Yeah, so I'm going to be competing in October at the weightlifting.
Fuck yeah. Let's go.
So
At
what is
the
it? 100,
weightlifting, you're gonna
120?
lift the weight over your head.
Yeah, the whole
100,
warm-up room, I'm just going to do
I
plyos
want
in
to
the warm-up
say
room.
130. Do we say 130?
130, dude. If I
That'll
just
be
had to
something
jerk
new.
it off
That'll
of
be weird.
blocks, I'm pretty confident I could jerk 130 if it was from blocks. But then again, I can clean more than I can jerk anyway.
Well,
So
that's
maybe
how
I
it
can.
starts.
Yeah. We'll see.
All right. So we'll say 100, 120. That's going to be the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah, dude, I'm here for it. I can't wait to fucking see it. It's cool to see the
man.
training. Keep tagging me in the weightlifting videos, no matter how much arm bend there is. I'm actually a little bit disappointed we didn't get into the point of talking shit. Yeah.
I know. Well, we should do another one.
Yeah, I expected we would talk more
like,
shit in this podcast, but
well, when we go to Seattle, we'll do this XL with Shallow there, and we'll just talk shit to him.
Yeah, that sounds perfect, man. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you taking the time today.
Sure.
If people want to find you, it's just Killian.Hamilton on Instagram, correct?
Super easy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
find this dude there. Killian's
K Hamilton at pre-script.com. And you can go to the Prescript website or my link tree on my Instagram, and you can actually book a Q&A call with me, yours truly, Killian Hamilton, where I will help place you on your educational pathway with Prescript. We will match where you're at with where you want to go with the right course and pathway to get there.
Yeah, it's been awesome getting some good feedback from those calls. So if you guys just want to hang out, talk to Killian about where you fit into the Prescript curriculum, check that out. Talk to him about that. He's teaching the level 1 now too. Next intake will be September. We'll have a skill acquisition course coming up soon, probably in late summer or fall time. So you guys can find him there. But other than that, thanks for hanging out, Killian. This was a great talk, and I'm sure you'll be back soon.
For sure, man. Thanks so much, dude.